It's Alive. I'm Scott Santons. I've been researching, writing, and advocating for the concept of UBI for the last 10 years. For those new to the concept of UBI, it stands for Unconditional or Universal Basic Income. It's the idea that every individual in a society can and should be guaranteed a periodic cash payment without means test or work requirement in order to make their way in the world upon a firm foundation. I recently started the Income to Support All Foundation, or ITSA Foundation, which provides support to projects that aim to make UBI a reality through research, storytelling, and implementation. You can learn more at itsafoundation.org. It's Alive is a show here on Spaces. We meet here every Wednesday at this time for 2 hours and talk about the developments of the world of UBI and meet with people who are making them happen. The recordings are available on YouTube, and you can find a link to that in the reply underneath the space. My co-hosts are Conrad Shaw and Josh Worth. We're the co-founders of Comingle. Want to say hello, guys?
Howdy.
Howdy.
I'm getting the some of the one of the comments in place with all the links for later. So
excellent. All right.
It was slow on the draw.
All right. Thanks, Conrad. Josh, do you want to tell everyone just a bit about Comingle first, too?
Yeah, Comingle. It's the money sharing app that we're working on that allows people to pool a percentage of their income into a community fund that gets divided up evenly every week. And the result is that members give money when they have it and get money when they need it, so that no member ever goes a week without income. And you can learn all about it at comingle.us.
Thanks. Yeah, and for those who don't know, Comingle just had a successful crowdfunder on Indiegogo, and if you want learning more about it, as we'll be talking about it here, along with other things, if you're interested, you can still support that directly on Indiegogo, even though that campaign is already finished. It's ongoing, and we will be joined today. We have a special guest, and it's Stacey Rutland of Income Movement. And looking forward to getting into the topic of really the organizing and mobilizing that basic income needs in order to happen. But before we get to that, I also like to just start off a bit with some basic income news, what's been happening recently. And this week, I just want to mention some of the big news that has been coming out of Canada, since that's been really what a lot of Twitter especially, but social media has been talking about. A lot of various headlines saying that Canada is considering a guaranteed universal basic income program because they had a discussion in the Senate Finance Committee last week. And this was something that that was timed to be with, or was it the National Day for the Ending of Poverty? And they have two bills there in Canada. And one of these bills, in their House and their Senate. And so the Senate Finance Committee decided to kind of have some discussion related to their bill S-233, which is an act to develop a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income, is its title. Now, this has led to quite a few number of tweets from the, let's say, the more conspiracy right, and people freaking out about, oh, Canada is implementing communism, Canada is going to destroy everything and go bankrupt through doing this, and that it's of course, it's a vast conspiracy by the World Economic Forum and George Soros, and everything else is actually apparently running Canada. And one of the things I also enjoy is saying that, like, this is like a top-down thing where Trudeau is somehow like a big fan of basic income, and he's trying to like force it through against people's wishes, which is, I mean, all this is just is nonsense. So I just want to clear the air and just get some solid information out there about this too. So this is a really just kind of a call for research that Canada is looking to do. And so what it would do, and so this is the actual text. It says, so within 1 year after the day on which this act comes into force, the minister must prepare a report setting out the framework, including any social, health, and economic conclusions and recommendations related to its development, and cause the report to be tabled in each House of Parliament on any of the first 15 days on which that House is sitting after the report is completed. And the minister must publish the report on the website of the Department of Finance within 10 days that the report has been tabled in both Houses of Parliament. And then with the report within 2 years that the report referred to in Section 4 has been tabled in both Houses of Parliament, and every year after that, the minister must, in consultation with the parties referred to in subsection 3.2, undertake a review of the effectiveness of the framework, prepare a report setting out the social, health, and economic findings and recommendations related to the implementation and effectiveness of the framework, and cause the report to be tabled in each House of Parliament on any of the first 15 days in which that House is sitting after it's completed. So that's the legalese behind this. But just to translate that, I mean, really this is just about the Senate getting a report done to look at just how a basic income could could affect Canada based on a specific implementation, and looking at what that implementation could look like. If the act were to pass, it would not implement a basic income in Canada. It would just implement a report being done, and that report would need to be tabled on a regular basis to really get that discussion going. And another detail of this is that there's a pretty much a similar thing in the House. And as far as Canadian politics goes, it's the House that has the power of the purse. So even if the Senate were to pass, a basic income law or something, it wouldn't matter. It's up to the House to pass something like that. So it's cool. It's interesting. It's great to see some support in the Canadian Senate for this, especially among certain members on the Senate Finance Committee. But this is not, Canada is not about to immediately implement basic income. I wish they were, but that's not about to happen. And I also think, like Trudeau is someone who has expressed a complete lack of interest in basic income for a while now, disappointingly. And he's certainly not the one pushing this. This is just some members of the committee who know enough to know that basic income is a good idea. And this is not some, President Trudeau is trying to push this. So yeah, it would be fun. We could maybe talk a little bit about that if we want down the line. But I just wanted to get that out of the way as the big news of the week, since there's just so much discussion of that on Twitter recently.
So it's basically another case of just, do we have permission to discuss this? Is that pretty much what's being proposed in Canada? And somebody's
right, like an asking for permission to discuss versus an actual discussion.
Are we allowed to
versus
even
an actual
talk
implementation?
about this? Yeah. So please allow us to talk about it. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a good segue for what we were talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
I've sort of, just in terms of will politics get it done, it seems like no one will step foot into that territory of a new or radical or fundamentally transformative idea unless the public already wants it, which sort of implies the need for grassroots and organizing. And with people so focused on lobbyists and politicians all the time, it makes me sort of skeptical that there's a way to do that. Like, who's in the U.S. Presidential campaign? I think Marianne Williamson has, like, sort of gone back and forth between announcing a general support for the general idea, but not really going too far. And I think, what's his name?
Cornel certainly West, not in our platform.
Cornel West's announcement on his platform is that he wants to put together a committee to think about it. It's like,
right.
There's no one taking a bold step on this, and it seems like they won't until, like, in terms of political strategy, until we make it a necessity. The public has to demand it.
Well, yeah.
What do they say? Washington's not a city of leaders; it's a city of followers. They have to be told what to do. That's essentially their job. So we have to make sure we're telling them loud enough.
Well, yeah, Stacey knows all about this.
Yeah. Let's bring in Stacey Rutland, founder of Income Movement. Stacey, could you introduce yourself a bit and tell us a little bit about Income Movement?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. Lovely to be able to have a good conversation with you all about what's happening in the U.S. around building a movement for basic income, and just to be in community together. It's awesome. This is my first time in this type of forum. So I thought I was going to have a camera on me, and I don't, which is kind of refreshing. I'm like, sweet, I'm just going to be on a mic.
It's nice, isn't it? Yeah.
You probably look fantastic, though.
So Income Movement was founded in 2019. And we're an organization that focuses on supporting and building the grassroots community and deeper, broader community coalitions in support of basic income, really with the goal of getting to a federal piece of the passage of a piece of federal legislation for basic income. So we're really at the heart of it, thinking about everyday folks on the ground and people who are working with and supporting everyday folks on the ground who are experiencing our current economic systems and really kind of taking the brunt of it, and supporting them in advocating for, demanding, fighting for a basic income. So much of what Conrad was just speaking to around, what's happening in Canada, and that, you can have lots and lots of activity in legislative bodies around the idea of basic income. But that, can only go so far, because it is such a radical idea without constituents demanding that their electeds take it seriously and actually join in and become advocates for and champions for it, within their own bodies and of government, and really kind of putting the pressure on their colleagues to take it seriously.
Can we talk a little bit about the origins of Income Movement in 2019? So, 2019 is such an interesting year, even for something like this to have been launched. This is during Yang's campaign, and this environment where suddenly everyone was talking about universal basic income, really for the first time, on the debate stage and everything. And then, of course, followed by 2020, where things just went insane thanks to the pandemic. And just a little bit about just those origins in 2019 and what that was like.
Yeah. So my background is in human-centered design, and I worked in the private sector and the business sector for a long time, doing that work. And in 2018, I founded a design agency. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. Founded a design agency, and by 2018, I knew I wanted to leave that work and move back into, I started out as an educator, as a high school English and social studies teacher. And I really wanted to move back into a space where I felt like there was, where I was helping make change that I felt was really necessary and in some ways kind of looming, based on the state of all of the things. And so as I was thinking about making that shift and really bringing this idea of how do we design programs, how do we design legislation that's human-centered, so the people who it's designed to support, how do you bring them into the fold and make sure that they're part of the design process of that legislation so that you actually have it, design it in a way that it does what is intended versus what often happens with legislation, that there's a lot of kind of poor design to it or poor implementation, and it can not have the impact or even potentially have a counter impact for the people that it was designed for. So as and with a background in history and social studies, I actually was focused on early Soviet history and economic theory and things like that. Basic income was something that was always very exciting and interesting to me. And of course, to your point, Scott, and towards the tail end of 2018 and all through 2019, the idea of basic income entered the mainstream with Yang's campaign. And so that became a very exciting and interesting place to potentially move my energy and kind of work. And so in addition to supporting grassroots work for Andrew's campaign, I also started to have conversations with folks who were in the basic income space that were leading organizations, just thinking where are the opportunities to potentially land. And so having conversations with Economic Security Project and some of the other organizations in the space, it became really clear that there was a lot of energy and focus within the kind of ecosystem of organizations on policy, but there wasn't really any focus on the actual kind of building the grassroots engine, and ultimately a supportive place for if and when Yang's campaign ended, where can all of the folks who got turned on to his campaign by the idea of UBI, where can those folks land that where that energy and excitement can continue and they can continue to do what so many folks who were supporting the campaign were interested in, which is continuing the fight for basic income. So when it was clear that there weren't any organizations that were actually doing that work, and ultimately, at the heart of it, we recognize that when it comes to building a grassroots community and really supporting grassroots folks and the building of coalitions for any movement, you really need to have those separate from the policy engines and the policy wonks of the movement, because policy folks are often very pragmatic. They look at the landscape and try to figure out what's possible, and grassroots folks should be fighting for what needs to happen, right? And so that tension between those two arms of a movement is important and critical. Otherwise, we find watered down legislation. We find, a broad range of things that can happen where the intention or the real kind of need out there that folks are fighting for gets kind of frittered away by those who are having conversations behind closed doors with politicians. So we started Income Movement towards the end of 2019, really with that idea in mind of how do we start to build the infrastructure and support for everyday folks and organizations who are kind of on the ground working with everyday folks who want to get involved and help kind of spread the word, help educate folks, and eventually, once the pandemic hit, the organizations who are actually implementing pilots, and how do we support all of those folks to have a kind of coordinated movement as we do our work.
Yeah, before we get into 2020, I know the first real action of income movement that you helped organize, and I just think you did such a great job of it too, was the basic income march. I'll just tell people a little bit about that event and just like all the places where it took place.
Yeah. So the director of finance for Yang's campaign left the campaign, and his name's Dylan Enright, and actually came together with myself and started to think what could the building of an organization for that grassroots side look like. And at the same time that we were doing that, thinking and kind of having conversations with folks, there were a couple of folks in New York, James Felton Keith and Diane Pagan, who had been involved in Diane Pagan had been running a monthly basic income kind of evening where folks who believed in basic income would come together and watch films or have discussions. And James Felton Keith was running for Congress at the time and was a big believer in data dividends and kind of the tech side of how you can generate income for folks out of the systems that already exist. And they both were very interested in taking that idea of a monthly get together with people who believe in basic income and taking it into a public forum. And so through Dylan's relationship, obviously when Yang's campaign was running, and anybody in that campaign was having regular interactions with almost anybody out there that supported basic income. And so these two folks, Diane and James Felton Keith, were on Dylan's radar, and they actually had been having conversations about this idea of a public kind of public celebration or public demand for basic income. And so we started to talk with them. They had mentioned that a march seemed like it would be great, but neither had experience organizing a march. And then another amazing person that I'm not really actually sure how she originally became involved, but Giselle Huff with Fund for Humanity had a little bit of budget. She had some money, and she said, I can throw some money at this if you guys are really serious about organizing a march. And so we started, I believe we started about sometime in mid-August. And the first march was actually in October. We ended up pushing it out a few weeks because of the tight timeline. But we started organizing, starting with specifically in New York, but very quickly we had folks all across the country saying that they wanted to do something as well. And so within a couple of weeks, we had 25 cities, people in 25 cities who wanted to organize some kind of public display, whether it was a march or a gathering, with some speakers, to really have a public display of support for basic income and make sure that all of this energy that was happening really around Yang's political campaign was established as a broader effort to fight for basic income. So we had two big marches, one in New York and one in San Francisco. And we actually had the one in New York on a Saturday and the one in San Francisco on a Sunday. And then the other, I think it ended up being 32 cities across the globe. And I think about 10 of those were happening in other countries. And somewhere around 20 or 22 of those were happening here in the United States. Dylan and I ended up being able to support the march in New York, and then we flew on Saturday, and then we flew to San Francisco and did the march on Sunday in San Francisco. And it was a pretty amazing and awesome experience. It's been interesting since then. And Scott, you were a speaker there, and I believe, Conrad, you were a speaker. Were you a speaker there? I can't remember. I think you were. I
speak anytime you'll let me have the megaphone. They just hand me the megaphone and say, come up with a chant. And I just go crazy. I wrote a poem for the second march.
Yeah, totally.
Some people liked it.
I just remember it was just such an amazing feeling and experience to be there. Like here, I'd been just talking about basic income for years and trying to get people excited about it. And here I was like marching down the street and these chants from, hundreds of people, a big old crowd full of people, they're holding basic income signs and talking about basic income now, we need it, and all these various chants. And it was just incredible, like this feeling of, oh my gosh, like this has finally arrived. Like people are finally getting involved and they're really starting to literally get out on the streets and push for basic income. It was just an amazing feeling.
I want to reiterate that and Stacey's role in all of this. When I came to the movement, it was in 2016, late 2016, and I saw what it was at the time was once a year a bunch of academics got together, or like 30 or 40 academics got together and to talk about what essays they'd written that year, or it was a very academic thing. It was starting to get a little sexy on the tech side, like Zuckerberg mentioned it once or something like that, but that was about all that was going on. And my wife Day and I were coming from seeing the activism, in the climate justice space, in the Bernie campaign, like stuff with real public energy behind it. And our perception was that that's what this needed. It needed real organizing, and the people in place and the organizations in place were not organizers at the time. That was not their skill set. And, Day and I, like the projects that we're doing are about tools for a movement and tools for organizers, but we're not organizers ourselves either. So when Stacey came in and said, hey, we're doing this march, and then she kept it going, she's been very vital to, and Income Movement have been very vital to not only our projects, but the movement itself. Like they put together these yearly conferences, these marches, but also Stacey's, I kind of imagine her as like the spider putting the web together. Like she advises everyone's projects everywhere, and she connects everyone. And
a very friendly spider, a friendly, beautiful, warm spider.
The kind that you don't kill or even put outside. The kind that you're like, no, you're very important to this household.
I like spiders, so that doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a nice metaphor. I'm just saying, he's super helpful.
Yes, a Charlotte's Web style metaphor.
Right,
we lean on Stacey a lot, is what I'm trying to say. Everyone should listen to what she says, even though she's humble about it, because she knows what she's doing.
Well, I think it's also interesting. I mean, there's a couple of things about the march I remember, so we had in New York, we had, I think 6 or 7 different speakers, and one of them was Andy Stern, and he was just a couple years off of the publishing of his book, Raising the Floor, and obviously he just had a wealth of experience in the labor space. And I remember meeting, all of the speakers. We had a meeting, a week before or whatever, just to talk about what the lay of the land was going to be and the order of speakers and some of that. And I remember Andy at some point saying, like, what's your expected turnout? And at that point, this really was like 8 weeks of, hey, we should do this thing, to holy shit, we're doing this thing, like walking to, marching down the road. And so it was hard to actually understand or know or anticipate what the turnout was going to be. We had, this was before the pandemic, and so it was really before a lot of the tools that are out there that help unify people around specific events. So there were like a lot of Facebook event pages that were up all over, but like actually getting a tally of like who all is, raised their hand and said, oh, we're showing up for this. We didn't really have a clear sense. And, Andy said from his experience, just getting 50 people together is like almost unheard of. And, that's just at that time, the kind of climate around activism, in particular around economic justice, was just very quiet. And so we had, it was hard to get an actual official count, but somewhere between 800 and 1,200 people showed up for the New York march, and we shut down one side of the street that we were on, 2 lanes, and marched, and with the police escort on both ends, and it was a pretty awesome experience. We took up many blocks of the road as we kind of marched down the street. Lots of people on the sides of the street being like, "What are you talking about?" And we had, people were handing out flyers and information. It was pretty cool. And there were a few folks there that were documenting it, collecting like both photographs and also video footage. And footage from the New York march is in every single documentary that's come out about basic income in the United States since. So that footage has made its way around the kind of documentary scene quite a bit. So you can see it at the end of Inherent Good. You can see it at the end of Storming Caesar's Palace. It's also in Raising the Floor, at the end of the Raising Floor documentary as well. So it's been kind of cool to see that really was an important inflection point for all of us. And it's cool to see that experience that we all had continue to make its way into the tools and films and things that we're all utilizing today to continue the work.
Yeah.
Although none of my chants got into those films, I noticed.
It was because of all the royalties they would have had to pay, I think, to you.
Yeah, I was up all night writing those things. They probably didn't want to distract from whatever they were.
Do you remember some of the chants? I don't remember them off the top of my head, but yeah, as the writer of those chants, I mean, you could remember some, right?
I had one where I just kind of freeformed it with the same call and repeat that this is why UBI. I was like, how are you going to pay that overdue rent? This is why UBI, and it just went on for a long time. And people got into it, and then they got exhausted, and then it circled all the way back around until they were into it again. And then I lost my voice, I think.
I think it's also interesting, the culture. I don't think I've ever shared this, but the culture between the two larger marches, the one in New York and the one in San Francisco, was significantly different. And so like in New York was we had a pretty broad range of folks that were working in a lot of different spaces around economic justice who supported basic income. Hawk Newsom, who was kind of leading one of the kind of, I guess, unofficial chapters of Black Lives Matter in New York City, who'd been doing a lot of activism, a lot of marches, a lot of disruptive action. He was leading the march, and we were marching, through parts of some of the most kind of devastated, economically devastated parts of New York. And it was definitely an energy. I don't remember the exact chant, but it was something along the lines of, what do we want, UBI? When do we want it? Now? If we don't get it, we're going to shut it down. And so it was this, and everybody, it was a real like energizer in New York. People were like, hell yeah, we're, and like, we're shutting down the street right now. We're going to shut down the government. You need to be listening to us. This is what we need right now. And then in the next day, on Sunday in San Francisco, that was one of the chants. And we were marching down Mission Street. I can't remember what street, but just right. I mean, we were literally marching right past Twitter at the time, like the Twitter offices, and at the Capitol or main kind of government building and stuff. And in the middle of the march, somebody comes up to me and says, "We don't feel comfortable saying we're going to shut it down." Nobody around me wants to say that. And it's, that was definitely like a much more, that march was, the root of that march was Silicon Valley folks in the tech space, probably, not necessarily coming from a social justice or activism perspective, but a lot of folks who were supporting Yang's campaign. Yang came out. There was a rally after the march that associated with Yang's campaign. So it was super interesting to be, in these two
Right.
Very
different spaces.
Yeah, and just be like, okay, the people who are fighting for UBI, there's a really broad range of folks. It's a really diverse set of people, and everybody's, bringing that perspective to their activism, which was just kind of funny.
What was like the biggest of the international marches? And like how many people was it? Was there anything like the New York march that was overseas?
Yeah. I don't know the numbers. There was a pretty cool march in Seoul, South
Makes
Korea.
sense.
There was in Berlin and Amsterdam were some pretty big events as well that had from what we saw of the footage and the photos, hundreds of people in the streets with flags and signs and speakers, kind of getting folks energized and rallied. So I think those were the three biggest cities that had the biggest kind of turnout.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And for anybody also who's curious about this too, you can actually go to basicincomemarch.com and you can see some of the photos and learn more about even each of these events, since they're all like still listed and stuff. It's really interesting just to head over there and check it out. So marches happen. That's October 2019. And I'm sure you're exhausted right after this, and in November and stuff, you got the holidays and 2020 rolls around, and what's going to happen in 2020? And March happens, and this, of course, we've got Yang dropping out of the primary after the showing in Iowa, and there's a deflation there with people feeling just like, oh, this it's not going to happen. And what's next, and a lot of people feeling lost and stuff. So many people in those marches now wondering what's next. And then pandemic hits, 2020.
Yeah.
And it was amazing to see how just immediately, like just in an instant, everyone was talking about, we need to do like a temporary emergency basic income. We need these monthly checks. And we started pushing hard for those monthly checks. We're going to talk about just like that, what was that like in March 2020 and what happened?
Yeah. I mean, the last half of 2019, we hosted at the march in 2019 in October, not as an official organization. It was really actually for us, like, is there something there, right? Like, is there energy? Is this the right moment? Because in our conversations with some of the organizations that are in the policy space that have been around for, multiple years, they talked about that other folks had tried to kind of harness and support grassroots and kind of, everyday folks and bring them into the movement, and that there just hadn't been the energy there. So the march was really an opportunity for us to see, like, does this movement, or the state of where things are at, does it warrant having an organization that is solely focused on that grassroots and coalition building side of it? And the march has just really solidified that yes, this is critically important, and there's a lot of energy and excitement around the idea, and a lot of people who are so excited about it, they're moved to direct action, which is really the big piece, right? Like, are people going to want to have a place to land to continue to do the work? So we formed the organization at the end, in like December of 2019, and then yes, our actual first thing as an organization was we held a 2-day convening in Portland that was really with folks from Economic Security Project, and you were there as well, Scott, and some of the lead organizers of kind of different Yang Gang hotbeds, folks from like the Boston Northeast area that have been doing amazing work, and some folks who were in a kind of a range of different spaces within the community. And we actually brought everybody together and started to map out, like, how do we actually do this work? And that was a week before the shutdown.
Yeah, like even Giselle couldn't make that. She was
Yeah.
calling in from her home in the Bay Area because of, because of COVID, and
Yep.
not like
Yep.
like feeling that it's not the best to be in that environment and want to get
Yeah.
it. And so
Yeah.
it's just crazy the timing of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that was a hybrid event. We had, I think, 5 or 6 people who's kind of zoomed in. This was before everybody even knew what really Zoom was. But yeah, we had some people remote in for the 2 days, and then we had some folks come in. And the goal of that convening was really like, what is happening in this space, and how do we start to think about coordinating and collaborating, specifically around like what some of the shared interests, shared areas might be. And one of the things that we did during that was we actually talked about a kind of natural disaster or health disaster, because obviously we knew the pandemic was looming. What's a response as a coordinated effort what could that look like? What would we need in place in order for us to be as effective as possible in advocating for basic income as a response? And so, I know that early in 2020, Economic Security Project had actually started pulling together a piece of legislation, Emergency Money to the People, I think is what it was called. And they had a couple of folks in the House that supported that idea. And so as soon as the pandemic hit, they handed that piece of legislation basically over to, I think, Representative Ro Khanna and a couple other folks, and then a few folks in the Senate actually came together and supported the bill as well. And so we had a piece of legislation basically ready to go. And I mean, I remember 2 weeks into the pandemic bringing together constituents with elected officials, with people in Congress, to talk about why it is that they needed to support that piece of legislation and why we needed monthly stimulus checks. I mean, they weren't called stimulus checks yet because the first ones hadn't gone out,
right.
But we needed monthly checks to stabilize income, and that the congressional response needed to be directly to the people and not through other channels of banks and all these other things that happened in 2008 that totally screwed a whole generation of people, that like they needed to be thinking about this in a different way. So there was in some ways, the pandemic was an incredibly difficult moment for an organization that's rooted in grassroots activism and direct action. It's a tough moment to be starting because people can't be physically in the same spaces. And a lot of the tools and resources we have that are digital and online right now to help with that organizing, we're in their infancy. And so that was a little bit, we were kind of making things up as we went along, because we really were trying to understand how do we keep the energy moving and actually keep people together and feeling like they have a sense of community in a moment of kind of deep isolation. And but at the same time, the pandemic, so we have this kind of negative side of like, oh shit, like how are we going to actually get people together? Just a few months ago, we had these amazing marches, and that is not going to be in any foreseeable, future. That's not going to be how we're going to be doing this work. But at the same time, of course, the pandemic was this massive shock to the globe, and certainly to folks in our society who had not lived in financial precarity before. So it was an important moment where actually there was this opportunity, like we're speaking to, of a piece of legislation and then the ability to have like kind of deep advocacy across the broader country in fighting for that to be what Congress passed as a response.
I just remember being so excited too with the first stimulus check. Like this was, again, this was like a very quick like turn in the discussion where everybody was immediately talking about cash.
Yeah.
And just to see so many members of Congress actually tweeting about that and saying we need cash. And then like even Trump was very excited to put his name on the checks. Like he insisted that his name be on the checks.
Yep.
And of course that was very necessary and needed. And even though we wanted monthly checks, we continued pushing for monthly checks too. Then we ended up getting the second and the third check. The whole time we're pushing for monthly checks. But there were some like I one of the things I really remember as feeling like a victory was that there was enough momentum behind this that even Nancy Pelosi talked about guaranteeing income. And it's like, wow, like Nancy Pelosi felt she needed to say something about this.
It's time for us to start to consider a guaranteed income. I know that clip was just like, I think there was so much like, oh my God, Nancy Pelosi just said it.
Well, that's what happens when you get lots and lots of people talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good, So what happened since then? A lot of people were talking about it. There was a lot of pressure and it sort of started to fizzle, and you don't hear the Nancy Pelosi's of the world really talking about it much anymore, or not in a serious way. So we had this huge moment where the pandemic really catalyzed the energy we already started to build.
Mm-hmm.
And we had this huge opportunity. We were excited, like this is our chance to make a big change.
Mm-hmm.
And we got, the temporary, we bumped up the CTC and we got the stimulus checks. But then it just kind of fizzled and people seem to have, lost hope in general. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in a lot of this work. I mean, what do you think about, Stacey, in terms of what happened there and what has to be next to rekindle that fire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few things. I mean, it's not unusual for something to become part of the everyday discourse around how our society functions and what needs to happen, and that being tied in particular to a very specific shared event that folks in a culture or society are experiencing. And then when that event fades, so does the conversation. I think there's a lot of when it comes to the folks who jumped on board with the idea of basic income or the idea of stabilizing income during the pandemic, their own framing of that concept was within the idea of a kind of global or national financial shock, right? This like kind of unprecedented moment, requires unprecedented response. And so I think, you mentioned the CTC, the child tax credit, in 2021, I think there's a few things that are really interesting or important for us to be thinking about as a movement. So one, the expanded child tax credit got passed by Biden as it's like his first big American Rescue Plan piece of legislation, like in whatever it was, late January, early February, the first weeks of his presidency. And that expanded child tax credit was really kind of caught everybody in our movement off guard, because we didn't know that it was it all happened very quickly, right? And obviously we're most of the work that we're doing is in this idea of getting monthly checks to folks, monthly stimulus checks to folks, and we're dealing with and working with existing Congress members and their constituents. In the meantime, as Biden is running, we now know that he has a whole set of advisors that are pulling together what's going to be the first piece of legislation as their like definitive response to the pandemic. And in there is like Representative DeLauro and others have been working on the child tax credit and expanding it and thinking more expansively about tax credits as a way to support families. they've been working on that since the early 2000s. So we're talking about almost 20 years into a fight for something that in that moment, they basically handed all of that work and all of that thinking over to the Biden administration, and they kind of slipped it into the American Rescue Plan. And as we were sifting through that piece of legislation after it was passed, it was like, oh my gosh, what got integrated in there around the child tax credit is a basic income for families. So, it was going to everybody. Most tax credits only go to folks who at least have some kind of income. So even people with a zero income were going to be receiving it. It increased the amount per child. And then it also was for half of the year being distributed monthly. So it was functioning as a basic income for all of the families who received it. And that income threshold was really high as well, which is, in many ways because of the pandemic as well. It was like $200,000 for an individual single head of household and $400,000 for dual income. So you basically had a vast majority of parents across our country receiving it. Now, all of those things were incredibly exciting and really energizing. And for certain parts of our of the basic incomes kind of policy community, tax credits became a really important and interesting area to double down on. Economic Security Project had already been thinking about tax credits as an important entry point into basic income, but seeing that how kind of easy that was just kind of slipped through the American Rescue Plan, I think that was like, okay, now there's a lot of folks in our community who are really doubling down on that and pushing hard. And we can see that continued work in some of the state policy work that's happening around expanding state level child tax credits and EITC, that are income tax credits as well. So, but I think what I would say also though is that that response, so being poised and ready for this really kind of innovative way to implement tax credits is, 2 decades worth of work on some members of Congress that was their baby for decades, just working and working and working and trying to figure out building support, finding their moment and handing that over. And so I think there's a lesson there for us to be understanding that this is not, these are not, we had a moment and it was a really exciting moment. And even within all of the work that had happened for the child tax credit, they only got it for a year. They couldn't get it renewed. And this is people who'd been working, people on the inside and people, and on the grassroots side who'd been working on that for a really long time.
I think it's a super important point for people to take to heart, is how much preparation there needs to be or can be advantageous when a moment of energy happens. It can feel like it just happened all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Like in these big, grassroots sorts of movements, the Bernie campaign, certain climate things, there's also the wonky policy thinking and getting things in place that happened for many, many years in advance, trying to be ready for those moments to occur. Like when the spark lights, you need to have developed, all the, I don't know what the metaphor is, the gasoline stores or whatever. You have to be ready to take advantage of it.
That's right.
Because what happens when the big catastrophe or the opportunity happens and you haven't come together as a movement or an organization or whatever around a policy that we want to push for, then it just becomes a bunch of people screaming that we're in a crisis, we have to do something, but there's not something we can all focus on.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that there's, so, there's been a lot of reflecting on like the child tax credit and why that expansion didn't get extended. I mean, we were in the same political climate. I mean, we can talk, ad nauseum about Joe Manchin and all of that. But I think that the reality is that that when we were on the ground having conversations, like in the second half of 2021, when those monthly checks were going out, that was going to end, and December was going to be the last check. That whole summer, income movement was and activists that are part of our community were out tabling in parks and at like farmers markets and having conversations with parents to, in anticipation of like, hey, we might need to hit the streets and say this needs to be prioritized, and really apply as much pressure as possible on Congress to get an extension of that passed for at least the next 3 to 5 years, so that those monthly checks continue to go out to families. And it was really interesting having conversations with folks, because I would say maybe 1 out of every 6 people we talked to actually understood what that payment that was landing in their checking accounts every month was. Like, there was really very little, and some of this is, in the moment. We've been receiving checks over the last year and a half from the government as stimulus checks, and so there's already a sense of like, oh, is this just another stimulus thing that I'm experiencing?
Yeah, more pandemic aid. Yeah,
that's right. Rather than something that's like, no, this thing called a child tax credit has existed for a really long time, and it's been bolstered, and this is something that could just permanently happen. And so
and there's opportunities to do that sort of thing with other existing policies to universalize them more.
Yep.
That's why, to me, like, the universality of UBI is the most important aspect of it. We could take other, like, disability support and other forms of social support and use what we've learned from just the agency and the freedom that comes with something that's universalized, not targeted, not so paternalistic or bureaucratic, as one route toward a UBI, to make our other policies look more like a UBI, right, and cut some of their inefficiency and cruelty out.
I have a question. I guess I think I do know the difference between a tax credit and just a basic income stimulus check. But I guess what is the difference? What's the when is something a tax credit and when is it just not a tax credit?
Like you could look at the stimulus check as a tax rebate, essentially, too. Like, you could look at it as a tax credit or a tax rebate, because there were no taxes involved with it. Everybody got that. So, if you owed $10,000 in taxes and you get your $1,200 check, like, you could actually help use that to lower your tax burden. And a tax credit, it's in terms of like policy, it's good to compare it to a tax deduction. So those are like your 2 different ways of doing it. So, like, we all get the standard deduction, and the way the deduction works is that you subtract the deduction from your total earnings, and then you pay your tax on that difference.
Right. So later on, you're going to be paying for the money that you received. Possibly, if you already owe taxes, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, technically,
this gets into kind of how Comingle works a little bit, just in that, like, the method of paying for it and the method of receiving it are sort of intertwined, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas just a stimulus check, you're not seeing the method for paying for it. There's nothing about
It's just coming from the government coffers,
right?
The minds of people,
which is kind of an interesting thing. Like, you get these. It seems like the checks that go out. Trump was really happy to have his name on the check, and I even remember there was, like, one of the Bushes was really happy to be sending out stimulus checks with his signature on it, and that just felt like, here's our gift to you, the government. Or here's our gift to you, citizen of the United States, from your president. Whereas if something's a tax credit, like, it's harder to understand, you're still getting the money in your
Oh yeah,
bank.
yeah.
But you
That's
then you do have to also say this is part of my taxes somehow, and it just gets, it's a harder message to convey, but it's actually a much more accurate message.
yeah.
It's
That's part
also
of the problems with existing tax subsidies and expenditures is that people are getting stuff and they don't even see them as getting stuff. It's like invisible welfare for the middle class and rich.
Right.
On the flip side, if you don't see where it's coming from, it feels like it's coming out of nowhere, which is a major misconception that people have about UBI. It's free money coming from outer space for everybody, or money creation, and it's not an ingenuous representation of what a good UBI policy would be, where you would want to pair it with some form of taxation, whether it is on someone's income or on carbon taxes or on corporate taxes or whatever, but in some sort of way to turn it from a helicopter money scheme into more of an actual redistributive or pre-distributive scheme to make sure the money is flowing where we want it to, but not just magically creating money out of nowhere. So with the stimulus checks, or with I think people got confused about where the money's coming from. It's just magical extra money, whereas with a tax deduction, there's sort of that, well, it's so complicated, that makes me feel good because I know it's complicated because they're paying for it somehow. Sort of psychological aspect
I mean,
to it.
just for me personally, I actually ended up, because my taxes get weird being a self-employed person. So when I was going to pay my taxes, I had to apply this credit to my taxes, and it's wait, all of a sudden I owe money. It actually, I was right there kind of at the middle. So I was, because I hadn't fully accounted for the tax credit, I could see the difference between, between being a net receiver or a net contributor to the. So I was right there at the middle. So I became a contributor at the time I was paying the taxes, even though I had been a receiver at the time the checks were going out.
Yeah, part of the way
Anyway.
that the child tax credit worked, it is a little bit confusing in that there was even an option to actually get it in advance or not, because it's a everyone got a tax credit as a parent, but also you could choose to get this rebated in advance for those 6 months, and then the other half of the total credit was still a credit, and so that was actually even designed to kind of balance out. Because if you did have 12 months of an advance credit, then you would have had a lot of parents who were like, oh my gosh, suddenly I owe more because they hadn't accounted for the advance payment. But with the 6 months advance and then 6 months standard, that was mostly a neutral impact, so that parents weren't too surprised by this. But yeah, that's certainly, it's a way of going about it. And in reality, if we were to say, switch from a standard deduction to a standard credit, and people would receive that in advance monthly as a basic income, then there would need to be adjustments via your higher larger withholding from employers to be able to balance that out come tax time. But yeah, those are the kind of details.
I mean, I think that to me, what's really important here, or what's an important conversation that has come out of this is the IRS the right arm of the government to be distributing a basic income? And I think after this, after the child tax credit experience and that expansion and all of that, it certainly, as a movement, muddies the waters and makes it far more difficult for us to actually have a straightforward conversation about what basic income is and what the implications are, and to make sure that the people who would most benefit from it would actually even receive it. I mean, the expansion of the child tax credit, having it be fully refundable, meaning somebody who makes $0 still gets it, is historically, at least for the last 2 generations, not how the IRS has functioned. And so we have a whole swath of our society who does not file every year because they don't make enough money to owe anything, and what they get back is so minimal or whatever it is, and so they just opt out of that system, of that process. And then you have a whole nother arm of people who hate the IRS, and it's the the boogeyman that comes and takes your money away, and you have to write a big check once a year. And so there's all of these different pieces of the way that our tax system and the IRS functions, that the idea of having what we all would consider like one of the most important humanitarian, and kind of economic justice pieces of legislation, the administration of that, the idea of putting that into the arm of the IRS is super problematic. And and it's fine for us to be as a community educating people about tax credits and fighting for broader tax credits and more money. I mean, we all are here because we think more people need more money. They need more stable income, and however we make that happen, great. But
the thing that it implies to me is we need an infrastructure where everyone is connected to a bank account, plain and simple. And whoever's running it, whether it's the IRS or the Social Security Administration or its own new basic income administration, all you really need is a system where everyone is signed up with, a non-commercial bank, or if it's postal banking or a federal bank, that would be a win anyway, to help deal with the unbanked crisis that we're facing. And that once something like that is in place, all you really need to do is give the right organization access to it to say, this is where you can drop the money. Then it becomes an easy situation. But what we have now, once they decided to give us stimulus checks, sometimes they took months to get to people. And people, like we had a guy who had been previously homeless, who had his first bank account for our UBI pilot. The only reason he got his stimulus check is, he's not very tech savvy, but we'd gotten him his first bank account. And he said, can you help me get this check? And because he had that, we could just sign him up where his stimulus check could drop exactly where we'd been dropping the basic income for him. And without that, he wouldn't have had his own little infrastructure and friendship and a bank account in order to make that transition easily. He would have just, he would have passed him by. And he's one of the ones who needs it the most. So infrastructurally, I think, some sort of federal bank is an absolute prerequisite and would be a win on its own. And, we get it in place. It just makes it solves a lot of problems on its own, but it would make it a lot easier to implement a basic income.
Or at least if we had some kind of little app that everybody had on their phone that would, I don't know.
That would be cool.
Where funds could be commingled. Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's also important. I mean, having something that is its own thing, that lives as its own thing, and the name of that thing is singular, like Social Security. I mean, when people start to talk about, when politicians start to talk about, reducing Social Security or money for Social Security is starting to run out, everybody knows what that is. It's not connected to taxes, directly. It's not connected to any other thing. It's, hey, when I hit 72, I want to be able to have some kind of additional income to help support me, right? Like everybody associates that with that, and everybody has skin in the game. So if we don't, we can certainly learn from that, in that the idea that we have a separate entity that is actually the basic income, is an important piece if we want this to have legs, and not just legs in the short term of like helping people understand what they're getting behind and what they're fighting for, but also in the long term, so that when politicians threaten to take it away, everybody can understand the implication of that directly on their own lives, and then be led to action, kind of fueled to take action to fight for it, I think is really critical.
Hey, we should check in with the audience because we're past the hour, and this is where we usually open it up to to people to ask questions as well. And we should also check in with you, Stacey, because we never actually found out how long you have to stick around. So, yeah, what do you think? Normally, we can just keep having the conversation. You can stick around as long as you want, and we start letting other people come up here and ask questions too.
Sure, I can go till about 40 after.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, cool. All right, and yeah, so I'll approve. Angie can be the first one. Before Angie gets activated here, I just want to also mention that one of my favorite things about the child tax
Good
credit
morning.
payments going out were the was all the viral TikTok stuff that people did. Like it was really fun to see people make all these TikTok videos about how they were using their child tax credit checks.
Good
It just
morning.
felt like hi, Angie.
There.
Good morning.
Stacey, thank you so much. I've been listening diligently to you, and I need some help with organizing because I was in a large space the other day here on X, and somebody was looking at my posts and what I liked and what I was involved with, and they noticed that I was on a list for UBI, and they asked me quite blankly, why do you support UBI? And before I could really get provide an answer, immediately they started talking about that it would make people worthless. You know, I'm sure you've heard that. I've heard it so many times, and it really made me sad because I'm a worker bee. I've always been a worker bee. Um, and I've reinvented myself so many times in my careers just to have a nice life, okay? And when somebody says something like that, like, and I believe this person even said, um, well, I couldn't use it because, you know, I couldn't, it would play no role in my life because I make enough money. And I thought, well, if you had a little extra at the end of the month, you could um, donate more, right? I remember
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Yang said something about that when somebody approached him that, you know, they are hard workers and they pull themselves up by the straps of their boots and, you know, and this UBI is just going to make everybody lazy. And I thought, it's not going to make me lazy because I am a worker bee um, by genes or genetics or just my temperament. I like doing stuff, and I'm going to be doing stuff until the day I die. And you know, sometimes I'm in my career, I made a little money, and if I had had a UBI, I would have been able to donate more of that money to maybe some causes um, that I believed in. So thank you so much, Stacey. And if you don't mind, I'm going to DM you, so maybe I could get some quick and positive answers to people who, because it just throws me off when somebody says that UBI would make somebody lazy, because I am so 110% for UBI, and it would never make me lazy. Thank you.
Yeah, one of my favorite responses to that, and what I immediately think of is, you know, I hope that person is also fully against any kind of inheritance and is out there like demanding 100% inheritance taxation, because like heaven forbid people inherit money and how that would damage them. Heaven forbid, you know, all these stockholders getting dividends, like those dividends must be incredibly damaging to the rich. Same with those who have their money in bank accounts earning interest, or those who have invested in treasury securities and that interest that they get. Like, oh my gosh, like, can you imagine? I feel so sorry for the rich getting all that passive income.
Yeah, and I mean the issue is people are trying to categorize themselves out of that category of lazy people, and rather than, you know, people want to say, I'm a different I'm a different species than this person over there, clearly, without saying it out loud. So there's different ways depending on the person to address it. It's not so much an organizing question; it's a messaging question. But you can point to data. Some people are influenced by data. In the pilots that have gone on, how come you see people working as much or more, working harder, getting better jobs? Is it, it in these cases, it clearly didn't make them worthless, and you could invite them to speculate as to why. This is the consistent finding in every pilot that's been done. Or if it's someone, like if someone who is inviting speculation, my answer is that deep down, we're all the same. We all want to have purpose. We all want to matter. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they're just accumulating and just surviving because it's boring. People want to think they're on this planet for a reason. That's why you don't become lazy when you make too much money. It basically frees you up to do what you find to be more valuable. Life is about finding the work that you want to do, and giving people money and power allows them to find that work. Yeah, that's my basic response.
Do you have a favorite one, Stacey?
Oh, did we lose Stacey? Where'd she go?
Oh, it looks like, yeah, she disappeared for a bit. I just had to reprove her.
She's back. She's got to, yeah. For the questions, so the title of the space is about organizing and mobilizing. So for the people we bring up, let's try to find a way to make it a question about the future of organizing, and how do we grow this into a movement with real energy again.
Yeah, so Jimmy, thank you for being here today. Do you have a question or comment along these lines?
I do. I was actually curious if there's any sentiment in regards to in regards to rebranding it. I think the dividend, name sounds a heck of a lot more understandable to most people, at least when you start talking about the term entitlements versus a dividend. Those things are really what kill a movement like this, is when somebody starts talking about entitlements. I know we're splitting hairs here, but that
I think it's a pretty huge thing, actually. I think we kind of underestimate how big that it can impact somebody. Just what Stacey was saying about Social Security. I don't think anybody even necessarily knows how Social Security works or what it is. I mean, plenty of people do, but it's not like there's no implied understanding of it when people get angry that it's going to be taken away. So yeah, different. UBI seems to be pretty. I feel that referring to it that way is invites enough conversation that isn't entirely one side or the other. That seems to work for it. But yeah, there was Andrew Yang was calling it the freedom dividend or.
Yeah, the freedom dividend.
Yeah, the dividend framing is really powerful. But these debates go on and on about what we should call it, and it's sort of a red herring in a lot of cases too. It's you have to go with what has the most traction and sort of reframe it within what's working. In a lot of cases, a lot of people reach out all the time and say, if you just called it this thing, then all of a sudden everyone would be like, oh, and we'd come to it. There's just so much more work involved, and in getting a movement of people behind a thing.
But what do you think, Stacey? Just in terms of how you're working on getting a message out, and so what have you come up against when trying to actually phrase that message?
I think there can be value in having, Social Security in the name. I don't know that most people, when you say Social Security now, actually think about the words themselves. But it's helpful to have the thing that you're trying to do in the name, for sure. Or what the big idea behind it is can be powerful in the early phases. But I would, agree or just kind of add to some of what Conrad is saying, is that I don't think that the hill that we need to climb to get basic income as a policy, even to be considered seriously. I think the things that we need to do are actually kind of hitting up against what the first caller was asking, or the first community member who was just asking a question or sharing their experience on this other space, where somebody was like, why UBI, right? Like, what are you talking about? Why do you support this? And that really is that we're coming up against 2 or 3 really, really significant cultural, what a lot of people feel to be as truths about how our society, in particular in the United States, functions, how it should function, and how our economy and every individual within it works. And so, we're talking about the Protestant work ethic, and if you work hard, you'll reap benefits from it. As a country, our idea about individualism versus the collective. When we talk about the idea of basic income to a broad range of folks, and this is across all political spectrums, all ages, all different, like, people who work in different industries, the thing that comes up consistently is pushing up against these core beliefs about the idea that each individual is responsible for themselves, and that we have a system that is meritocracy, that the amount of income that people make is based and directly correlated to the quality and quantity of their work, of their toil, and that toil itself is how we prove our worth in this society. Now, those are big, big ideas that are connected to people's relationship with their religions, to their relationship with their families, to their relationship with their governments, to all these different pieces, and direct relationships to whatever political affiliations they have. So I think that whatever, I agree with Conrad, having a conversation about like what we call it is a conversation that is worth having, for sure. And it's not where the work, it's not the thing that we hit up against when we're actually having conversations with folks. And I would say that, like, the things that I just, brought up are not exclusive to middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy people. We're talking about having a conversation with everyday folks in San Diego who are applying to be part of a pilot that's happening there. And we start to have these conversations, and they are talking about the internalization of these ideas that they are not deserving, that they don't have a right to have their basic needs met, that they're just not working hard enough. That they're not using the system to their advantage like all these other people who are successful. And so this is deep work that we need to be doing, and it's why that grassroots side of it, and like the kind of tenets of deep canvassing and people having conversations about this with trusted people. If you believe in basic income, one of the most important and impactful things you can do to support basic income is to talk about it with the people that trust you and know you, because it is a radical idea. And when it's coming from a politician or even a celebrity or an influencer or whatever, it's one thing. It's another thing if somebody you care about is like, hey, this is important to me, and this is why, and this is what this looks like, and this is actually how our system is working for me. How is the system working for you? Is this a myth that we live in a meritocracy? Can you actually cover your basic needs working 40 hours a week at minimum wage? Like, what's going on right now that is making it so that, we have a vast majority of our population that's suffering economically, and thus then emotionally, physically, because of the way our current system works. So I would just say that it's not small. It's not, let's call it the freedom dividend, and more people are going to accept it. Though I do agree that thought into what this is called is important, because it can people understand.
Was that a
I like that one.
What are the
Whatever that
clapping
was,
from?
but I didn't do it. But yeah, I guess it's
That was me by accident. I apologize. If I could just state that the root cause of this, in regards to how to organize and mobilize UBI, the root cause of this, it sounds ironic, but in order to introduce this in an easier way to the public and get a heck of a lot more of a buy off, is the moment we do that is the moment we take money out of politics. And I know that sounds cliche, but it is the truth, because those do connect.
Yeah, no, I mean, as far as the actual winning of implementation of basic income, I mean, the reality is that there's so many things that we have to fix at the congressional level, at the political level, and one of those things, of course, is the influence of money in politics. One of those things is just the way that we actually run winner take all elections. And I mean, we're witnessing right now. We have a completely broken Congress, thanks to a broken House, thanks to a handful of just absolute extremist Republicans who are just refusing to form consensus, with the rest of the party. There, and this has to do even that, like, their inability to work with the other Republicans goes down to the fact that there's no incentive to do that. That they, you have a primary system where all you have to do is win the primary. You skirt through the general thanks to gerrymandering. It's all about who can be the most extreme in the primary. You've got a national fundraising mechanism so that, if you're as extreme as can be in your district, then you can actually fundraise off of that nationally and continue to win. And, the reality, that any actual basic income in the U.S. has to actually be passed through the House and Senate and be signed by the president. So, yeah, there's definitely other things that need to happen too, that are, I believe, complementary, and maybe even have to happen first. Although also I think that basic income itself would help in ways too, so that even if we had some kind of small basic income, that could actually help, say with more grassroots funding, to get more candidates out there, and more policies that can make this possible too. Like, it's a big mix of things, but regardless, it does require this grassroots support. Like, even if we were to, let's say, get key members of the House, Senate, and the president in place to actually do this, so it's like a totally top-down thing. Like, boom, basic income, top-down, we have it. Well, if that could actually backfire by having so many people believe that they had nothing to do with this, that this is some kind of, top-down control mechanism, feeds into conspiracy theories, people push against it. Like, there needs to be mass support for this idea in order for it to be successfully implemented. That's just the fact of the matter, regardless of any other issues.
I don't know. You think so? You think? I mean, it's still working. Like, it's the policy is, no matter how it comes about, is still helping people that need help, right?
It's just going to need to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
for a whole generation, it's going to need to be protected until it just becomes seen as, like the kids who are being born now. If we were to have a basic income passed, in the next few years, then the kids that are born now, when they're adults, it will be in their, kind of cultural DNA that this thing exists, and it'll become something like Social Security. But before then, it has to be like diligently protected, because every new, it's like the Affordable Care Act, or, like these things that actually are substantial shifts in how a whole part of our kind of society, a whole kind of arm of our society functions, they become, the scapegoat and politicized. And as we have turnovers in Congress and in the White House and all that kind of stuff, like, we just have to, and even in, the Supreme Court, if any of this stuff ever goes to them, like, there's just things that we're going to have to be strong on. And if the people are strong on it, then, I guarantee you, if there had been millions of people in the streets challenging, demanding that the expanded child tax credit continued, Manchin would have folded, and it would have gotten passed for at least another whatever was on the table, another 3 years or whatever.
Well, one thing that's kind of beautiful about basic income is, while the North Star is, to me, something that's constitutionally protected in the Bill of Rights, that's really hard to overturn or mess with, right? And pegged to something that grows with the prosperity of a nation rather than, the fight for 15, the UBI version of that every 10 years. But there's something in it that's also has its own little protective nature, and that's in the universality of it and the regularity of it, where, what's one of the most difficult things to attack, and even though they still try to, is Social Security. And it's because it's something that we all, at least at some point, get, and that a lot of people are getting, that it's basically, going directly against the financial health of a big number of your constituents to even bring that up. And in the case of Social Security, you can still, demonize the elderly. But in the case of UBI, it's not very easy to demonize everybody and still have a political career, So it has its own sort of immunity to political trickery, because every single person is invested in its sustained existence. So all of a sudden it becomes political suicide or it's a very difficult argument to make that, hey, we should get rid of this thing that pays you every week, right?
Yeah, no, it's also, but when it comes to welfare programs, as they say, poor programs, programs for the poor make for poor programs. Like just the targeting itself versus universality, it's such a big difference. Like it's so easy to attack something that you do not get, that you never expect to get ever, versus Social Security, where everyone expects to get it. And it's funny too when it comes to Social Security, I think, how it's so protected that people will even claim that the other side is looking to get rid of it. And they'll even, there'll be lies about that, where they're just accusing the other side of saying, oh, they're looking to get rid of it entirely. Vote for our party because the other side is against it. We saw that funny moment with Biden in Congress where he set that up like very well as getting like every Republican to cheer for, not doing anything with Social Security. Like it's just it's funny how just different that is. Universality is really important.
Well, it goes back to Angie's question too. It's like that's the answer in the UBI world when someone's trying to say, what about all the lazy takers and all that? That sort of response is only possible if you're confusing it with like a welfare program where it first determines who's poor and needy enough according to some set of standards and bureaucratic procedures to receive it. But in the UBI world, everyone's getting it, so it's sort of ludicrous to make that statement like all the lazy bums getting it. You just say, well, you're getting it, what are you doing with it? And that's kind of my other response to people who bring this up is I always make it personal first. If you say everyone's going to be lazy, well, let's focus on you. What would you do if you had X dollars extra coming in a month? And be serious. Don't just talk in generalities like you have it this month, next year. Like, what are you going to quit your job? Are you going to put it aside? What are you going to do? Make them come up with a real answer and then say, okay, now what's your brother going to do? Or as soon as people have to come up with a real answer, it makes it personal. Yeah.
So, Stacey, are you still available to talk? We got some other people that want to ask questions.
Yeah, I can stick around for a few more minutes, and I just want to kind of add on I think that there's also, I think that what you're speaking to, Conrad, is right. Like root it in your own experience of you and the people you love and what it would mean for them, or what like. I also think that there's something that we don't actually talk about very often, but that I've had conversations with people who consider themselves socially liberal but fiscally conservative, and have all these conversations about some of that same thing around like, well, you're going to have there's people who are going to take advantage of the system or take advantage of it. One of the things that I just bring up, and this is just because for worked in the and I know how large any large entity that has thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people within that organization or within that program or whatever it is, there is in the corporate world, there is built into all budgets, all everything, a certain percentage of people who are not going to be productive. So like Apple factors in that. I mean, maybe not Apple, maybe the culture there is pretty intense, but let's say, an insurance conglomerate or whatever it is, they factor in somewhere between like 10 and 20% of their workforce not functioning at capacity and actually being very low on the productivity scale from what their expectations are of what the output is going to be from their workforce. It's built in. Everybody knows that when you start to scale something to thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, that there's going to be some people that take advantage of the system or whatever, however you want to, frame that. I think there's value in somebody, who mostly is doing a lot of volunteer work, receiving this. I don't think that, again, that this needs to be tied to people's, toil. But the reality is that even in the corporate model, they know that there's going to be a percentage of their workers that aren't working, quote unquote, the way, that they should. And yet we don't throw out that model. We don't decide, well, we should stagnate wages in the kind of white professional class corporate, model, that we should stagnate salaries because 8% or 10% of their employees aren't pulling their weight. It's like, okay, that's just something we can factor in. And it's not, there's still growth, there's still profit, there's still all of these things that benefit that company. And so anytime I've had a conversation with somebody who's like a VP of a larger corporation or a C-level person, when you start having that conversation, they're like, oh shit, yeah, that's right, actually. Like there's not, if we fixate on that 8% or 10% or whatever it is, and we make decisions to like penalize them or take, kind of police them at the detriment of the 90% who are doing, who are utilizing this or benefiting the company in some kind of capacity, then you're going to kill the company. You're just going to.
Well, it's not even like it's not even like saying we should stagnate wages. It's saying like we shouldn't have companies, we shouldn't have a labor market, we shouldn't have anything, because there are some people out there who will take advantage of the system and not work as hard as we want. So
that's right.
We're not going to have work at all,
Yeah, just that idea that there's just factoring in this sort of human laziness factor, I guess, like is really smart. Like it's something that we don't have to just discount. Like, and I think it's also important to bring it back to like the individual level, like Conrad was saying, it's like that there's probably 8% of you yourself that is a lazy person who just needs to slack off and actually needs to take a break because they're sick, right? Like that. It isn't like you can't isolate that 8% down to 8% of the individual people. But I think a different way of framing it is like 8% of the time everybody is going to be slacking off, right?
It's also relative. Like what Apple's expectation for your work output is could consider you going home and fixing up your house and taking care of your kids to be lazy relative to their aspirations.
Yeah, non-productive.
A lot of productivity happens outside of the labor market, and where UBI sort of frees that up as well.
That's right.
It looks like Valerie's been wanting to talk for a long time.
Yeah, Valerie, do you have a question for Stacey or a comment about organizing and mobilizing around basic income? Valerie, you there?
You're muted right now, Valerie, I think.
Oh, here we go. I'm unmuted now? Good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. I wanted to say, actually, we have been stagnating wages since about 1973 and look at the deleterious effect it's had on productivity. I should first give a backgrounder. My name's Valerie Keefe. I actually, very long story, ended up seeking the leadership of a small party in Alberta, the Freedom Conservative Party, and a basic income. The Freedom Dividend was the centerpiece of my campaign. That was winter of 2018, spring of 2019. And I spent a lot of the last 20 years listening to a lot of conservatives and conservative thinkers and conservative voices. And I think one of the biggest handicaps that people trying to organize for basic income have is their ideological preconceptions. And I mean, we're looking at a program that instead of paying people to be poor and out of work, pays them to be alive. Not once do I hear anyone quoting Milton Friedman saying, if you want less of something, tax it. If you want more of something, subsidize it. You know, I'm hearing the phrase conspiracy thrown around. And I have to say, as someone who's trained in political science and economics, political and economic actors can non-transparently pursue their own interests. And there's a lot of very worrisome signals that we've seen with some very mysterious assassinations of radical leaders over the last 60 years. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that the West has a Praetorian Guard problem. You know, you might want to look at the people who are posting, do you think about the Roman Empire? But there's a lot of these preconceptions. I've seen erasure of the fact that homeless people are disproportionately male assigned. And I'm a radical trans feminist who wrote for the Queer Voices section of Huffington Post, and I've been quite vocal about this to Mr. Santons frequently. You know, that the erasure of these domestic violence victims, the male assigned who are disproportionate domestic violence victims, disproportionately homeless, that's part of the ideological coalition of what I would say Thomas Piketty, a Marxist economist, refers to as the Brahmin left, the credentialist left. I mean, in Alberta, our so-called Social Democratic Party ruled out a basic income. Why? Because it got in the way of all of the credential class subsidies that they already have.
Right.
Where, yeah, I mean, there's no discussion of the last credit premium and how we've effectively, because people want income security, we've gildified the entirety of the Western economy over the last 100 years. There's licensure and degrees behind everything, and the premium to getting that degree is far greater than the actual work put in from going from that last piece of coursework. In the United States, a four-year university degree the last credit comes with 70% of the increase in earnings over those 4 years, despite it being 2.5% of the coursework. In Canada, where we have 2/3 of the productivity of the United States, where we're poorer than we were in 2008, that number is even worse. In Canada, people with some post-secondary earn less than those with no post-secondary. And so if the left doesn't actually stop and recognize how unbelievably right-wing it's become while wrapping itself in a rainbow flag, people will not trust you. I also want to say, with respect to the UBI, you see a lot of figures on the establishment left talk about it because they want it to be a culture war issue, but they won't implement it. And this also drives resistance. I tend to think the power structure doesn't want it, so they want a loud, vocal right saying they're going to do this to bring in more conditionality. And considering how much economic warfare, which, you know, healthcare economist from Stanford, Jay Bhattacharya, talked about, and continues to talk about, he refers to them as the laptop class. I call the credential class as the paper class, had inflicted on poor people during this Category 2 pandemic that we treated as worse than a Category 5 pandemic. There's a lot of resentment. The reason that UBI, the reason that an unconditional citizen's income isn't implemented is partly because there is massive distrust that it will be unconditional. And it has not been allayed by people who have not really had, I would say, principles instead of pretexts.
I think I agree to a great degree. I think one of the things that came out of the pandemic is the attention to UBI picked up, and it sort of started to get framed as a partisan idea. It started to become a left-wing idea or a progressive idea, whereas the most powerful incarnation of it is a very non-partisan idea. It's power to the people no matter who you are. It's the universality of it that makes it powerful, and it makes it easier to organize around it, get people excited about it. Those of us who followed the Yang campaign, one of the things they always bragged about, and I think rightfully, was that they brought over more Republicans to their Democratic candidate than any other Democratic candidate, more than Bernie, more than anyone.
Agreed.
Because
And in response, Andrew Yang was called the incel candidate because the fake left has a structural transversal problem that it has not reckoned with.
There's a lot of signaling. And I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do with Comingle. And a lot of our work is to completely non-partisanize what this idea is and say, no, this is a practical idea. We come at this like engineers, like social scientists. We want to see it working in place. We want to have a version of it that has the actual universality built in, rather than, one of these other targeted pilot programs that is essentially not speaking to major swaths of the population. Once you make it open to everyone and you make the functionality of it truly universal, then I think you can start to reposition it and reframe it in its most powerful way. I think there could be huge support from the right-wing South. There could be huge support from the Rust Belt. There could be huge support from all over the place. And when we put together our cast essentially for the docuseries, we were filming people receiving UBI. It was crucial to us to get all of these different walks of life and see it through these different lenses. And I think one of the major failings of the movement, once all this energy came in and all this money came in, is there have been so many pilots and the messaging in general focusing entirely on very left-wing sort of target demographics, where a more universalist stance wouldn't leave them out. It just wouldn't leave other people out who would have a policy that they could get behind. And that's the real power of UBI, is people want to focus on the amount. People want to focus on the fact that it's cash. Both are important, but the universality itself is what makes it a truly transformational policy, both in terms of effectiveness, but in saleability. It gets us out of this political just limbo that we've been in for so long, this football game.
I agree. I strongly agree. I think that the only way, though, to get out of that limbo is there really needs to be some serious soul searching across the spectrum. I mean, you look at why there's less support for Social Security in the Republican Party. I think to some extent it has to do with life expectancy at 65 by assigned sex. I think we're not paying enough attention. There was a conference. I was at a fairly progressive institute, and they were trying to examine populist movements, but they were spending a whole lot more time just rubbishing them. But one interesting fact came out during a panel, Reproductive Rights and the Right, where the author said, well, Trump voters believe that men, as they define them, and for that matter in a fairly choicest manner, anyone who says a woman is anyone who says she is one is also defining them, that they are the people who are the most oppressed in the United States as a group. And if you look at quality of life in outcomes, we see that this is one of those things that Paul Krugman, if he were being more honest with himself, might refer to as dirt. It's this belief of a completely contradictory idea that turns off a lot of voters. That somehow we've got a privileged class that manages to lag in every quality of life indicator except headline income, and that's not, recognizing that equal work is equally deadly. Equal work is equally emotionally satisfying. Equal work has equal opportunity to check out at the end of the day. There's all sorts of factors that aren't engaged with, and because those resentments aren't paid sufficient attention to, and because there's a response of just sheer derision. I mean, I emceed freedom rallies over the last 3 years, and to see the response of a lot of people of just sneering laughter when people would say, my body, my choice, with respect to certain medical interventions. Well, ask yourself why Roe versus Wade became politically possible to throw out. I really hope that some people listening understand that radical change comes from a presumption of good faith, and that people on the other side don't trust the left. And I would say partly because the left isn't left-wing anymore. It's not being anti-hierarchical. It's as Thomas Piketty said, it's become a party of the credentialed classes and of special interests who often gamify systems that are supposed to dismantle oppression and end up upholding it.
So assuming we're all in agreement on this, like where do we go with it?
So can can I just
Yeah,
say
Stacey, please.
say a couple of things? I think that because the work, I mean, I think, Valerie, you're bringing up a broad range of really important points for sure. And I think I would, and maybe this is the kind of coalition building side of my brain, but I think that for me, in my mind and how we do this work, this is a yes and moment where like we need to be pushing on all of these things and understanding opportunities within a broad range of the work that's happening right now to do some of this work. And so I guess what I would say, Conrad, you brought up pilots and the problematic nature of targeted pilots and some of that. And I, as somebody who works with dozens and dozens of organizations who are implementing pilots across the United States right now, I think that there's a couple of really important things that we need to acknowledge, or opportunities that these actually bring to the surface that is real work on the ground that we can be doing right now and that is happening, that is important. Pilots, by the nature, whether we agree or disagree that with the idea that they're targeted, the fact that the reason that so many folks are targeting is the limitation of funds, but also the folks who are actually doing some of the implementation, which are a broad rate, a significant portion of them are community-based organizations who have existed for decades in their own communities, focused on a specific group of people. So if they've been working to support our unhoused community members, they now are implementing a pilot for unhoused folks so that there's a more steady and consistent income base. Now, what happens in that, what that pilot provides an opportunity for are a few things. One, most pilots are very localized, and it's an opportunity to have deep conversations with everybody across that community, from everyday folks who potentially could be participating in the pilot to mayors or city council members or county commissioners, to start talking about, and also importantly, funders. The kind of foundations of this world that are distributing money across the nonprofit space, to start talking about and actually challenge folks to understand when the work that they're currently doing to quote unquote end poverty or to support community members, is what they're doing actually designed to end poverty, or is it designed to perpetuate poverty but make them feel good about the fact that they're quote unquote doing something about it for a specific group of people? And what I've seen happen in a lot of these communities is a real challenging of this fundamental idea. You can be as progressive as you want, and you can say you're interested in ending poverty or addressing our housing precarity or our deeply racist and problematic healthcare system or justice system. But if you're not actually interested in doing something that's going to end generationally the situation that we find ourselves in, then you are part of the problem. You are continuing to promote and perpetuate a system that is dictated by whether it's the professional class, all the different kind of terms that you guys have been throwing around. I think that those pilots do, at least they have in the United States, for those organizations who are actually like deep in their communities, it's an opportunity to push this conversation in real ways. I mean, I've been in sessions where there's a bunch of funders, both and government entities, having conversations about will they support expanding and kind of reducing the targeting, expanding who can receive basic income. And it's a real conversation about what are you actually doing. We hear a lot of folks in the like large foundations saying things like, well, we'll support the research side, but we're not interested in funding the actual cash that goes out to people, because that's a hard sell. And that becomes a real opportunity for a deeper conversation about all of these all of these components of like how people are understanding how our system works, and also understanding how to address the root cause of inequity. And so I would just say that in addition to so many of these other pieces that have been brought up, the like boots on the ground work that's happening in communities where pilots are in place is fundamental. I mean, we're seeing people who are, electeds who are sitting on a city council are now at a state senator, and they've brought their experiences and having conversations around real systemic change and the real impact of direct cash, monthly basic income to people. They're bringing that into the conversations as they get elected into higher offices. And so it's all of it, right? These are all things that need to be happening at the same time. And I think it's important to have intellectual, philosophical, and academic conversations about this, but the folks who are on the ground actually deep in the implementation side have an opportunity to actually challenge in real ways some of this thinking. And if we have enough of that happening alongside these other pieces, we can start to potentially have a groundswell of shifting where this becomes part of the discourse that's happening culturally across different sectors. And then if we have some legislation in hand for when people start to actually get on board and understand, we might be able to start to move the needle on the actual, state level or federal level legislation for direct cash.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
we're at 2:00. We've been here for 2 hours. We usually wrap it up here. Stacey, thanks for being with us for so long. And just for final thought, call to action. If people want to get involved, what's the best way for them to get involved to help make this happen?
I can drop a link to we have a sign-on letter that folks can just add their name to that says they believe in basic income, and it actually is. We have thousands and thousands of people across the country who have signed it, and it actually becomes a key organizing tool so that if something is happening in your community, or your state or whatever it might be, that where you can actually have impact on decisions that are getting made, whether it's county budgets going towards, more basic income programs, whatever it is. It's a really good way to kind of raise your hand and say, I believe in this, and I'm up for continuing to take action. So I'll drop that in the post links here so folks can add their name to that if they're interested. And that really puts them into, the broader community and allows you to keep kind of in touch with what's happening.
Which is how we organize and mobilize for universal basic income. You get on the newsletters, you start to participate when the time is right.
Yep.
Yeah, but I wanted to say thanks to Stacey because I think what you were just talking about was having that sort of holistic view of the movement as a whole and having that perspective of seeing what people are doing on the ground, seeing what people are doing in philosophical circles, having that bird's eye view and being able to coordinate things between those different little bubbles of the movement is so important, and really appreciate it.
And it leads that awareness that it's a constant push. This is a constant push from lots of people all at once. It's not like a quick rebrand and it happens, or a quick moment and it happens. This is work that a lot of people are actively engaging in for many years to steer a ship,
That's right.
So thanks
all.
Thank you so much for being here, Stacey, and just also thank you so much for all the work that you do as well. It's amazing, and your work is definitely appreciated.
Thanks all. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we see folks who are listening to this in the future, and other conversations, other actions that we're lining up.
All right.
Thanks, Stacey. And thank you all for listening and for being here today.
Let me throw in one. I also dropped a post in the comments that has all kinds of ways people can get engaged with ITSA Foundation, with Comingle, our various projects, with the crowdfund. So check out that link, those links in the post as well, if you're looking for ways to get engaged.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you same time, 12 p.m. Eastern next Wednesday as well. Cheers, everyone.
Bye, everybody.